Hello and welcome back to another installment of From Pixels to Pictures, the show where we take a look at film adaptations of video games and try to figure out what went wrong. Today, we are packing heat and heading to Mars for an adventure filled to the brim with testosterone. One of the most popular video game genres out there is first-person shooters, or FPSs, games where you've got a gun, the camera shows your POV, and your objective is to kill anything that moves. And with all due respect to Wolfenstein, which is largely responsible for the creation of the genre, Doom was the game that perfected it. It was one of the most popular games of its era, and despite being fairly controversial at the time, it remains a fun and addicting experience, even to this day. So it's kind of surprising that it took this long for a movie to happen. The first game came out in 1993, and the idea of doing a film adaptation was floating around for a while, but a combination of real-world tragedies and a lack of a good script meant the project was stuck in development hell, right up until 2004, when the game company id Software screened a presentation of Doom 3 to the Creative Arts Agency. Gradually, more and more people became interested in the property, and over the course of the next year, the movie was made. Directed by... oh geez, you know what? I'm not even going to try to pronounce that name. Directed by this guy, and starring Karl Urban, Rosamund Pike, and Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. The film was released on October 21st, 2005. Despite having a strong opening weekend, the bad word of mouth spread so quickly that it had a 72% drop in its second weekend and ended up not being able to make its budget back. That is frankly embarrassing. So, why did the film fail to connect with audiences? After all, it seems like the easiest adaptation to get right. Just have muscular men with big guns shooting at demons on Mars. How could you screw that up? Well, let's take a closer look and see how this violent action juggernaut made the transition from pixels to pictures. Obligatory disclaimer. For this review, I was able to play the entirety of the original Doom, but only the demo of Doom 3, which is the game that this movie takes direct inspiration from. I really did try to do my research, but I apologize if I missed something. Round 1. Characters. Right off the bat, one recurring theme that you'll notice in this video is that the original game doesn't offer much in terms of characters and story. The original game came out in 1993, where video games did not have very compelling narratives, or characters for that matter. The main protagonist of the game is never even given a name, and the fans refer to him as Doom Guy. Yes, really. And it's not like there's a lot of other characters to talk about either. So the writers of this movie were basically given full creative control when it came to fleshing out their protagonist and the rest of the cast. Now, despite what the film's marketing may lead you to believe, the protagonist of this movie is not Dwayne Johnson's character, but rather this guy, Jonathan Grimm, played by Karl Urban. And he's pretty bland as far as main characters go. They do attempt to flesh out his character out a little with his relationship with his sister and some implied details about his past that the film doesn't fully dive into. I don't think Urban's performance is bad, but he's unable to make the character more engaging than what's on the page. With all that being said, he's not necessarily a bad main character, just not a very interesting one. Fortunately for us, he is not the only lead actor in the film. And I'm going to make a bold statement here. The character of Sarge might be the best written character in any of the movies I've looked at for this show. At first, he comes across as a standard leader for this type of group. He has charm and likability, but all his priorities lie on completing the mission. As the film goes on, we see that he's very focused on his job, and he seems to have very little patience for taking unnecessary risks. While his actions make sense, we the audience start to become aware that he's becoming stricter and colder until a certain moment in the film happens and you realize that he has become the villain. Not only does this plot twist help to enforce the larger themes of the movie and build to an exciting climax, but the casting of Dwayne Johnson is a pretty genius move because you don't see this coming even though you really should. It's important to remember that this is early in Johnson's acting career, back when he was still credited as The Rock, And sure, maybe a more experienced actor probably could have brought more nuance to the performance, but Johnson actually manages to pull off the transition pretty well, and I feel like this performance helped him earn a little more credibility as an actor. Speaking of actors whose best days were ahead of them, future Oscar nominee Rosamund Pike plays Samantha Grimm, John's sister. Now, my biggest takeaway from this performance is that Pike is a British actress playing an American character, and, well, you can tell she had a couple of dialect lessons in between this movie and Gone Girl. As for the character herself, sadly there's just not that much there. Outside of being the token woman in this male dominated ensemble, her main role seems to be to state exposition and explain about the monsters. Theoretically, her relationship with her brother should be the emotional crux of the movie, but it's just not explored enough. And that's not the actor's fault, it's the script's fault. I feel bad for saying that because the way Sarge was written actually really works, but the movie just wasn't interested in the emotional conflict between the siblings. But I will say this, I do think they managed to make the rest of the cast interesting enough. The film presents you with a lot of conflicting personalities in this squad, some of whom are really likable, others more disturbing than the monsters they're fighting. They do function well enough as a team, and I feel like you actually get to know these people, and some of the deaths in this movie do feel effective, albeit not as effective as they could have been. So on the whole, I'm torn, and I can't really go to the game for comparison because the game doesn't really give me much to latch onto. I feel like characterization was not the main priority for the screenwriters here, and with that in mind, I really do have to give them props for the way Sarge was written. I just wish the rest of the characters could have been given the same level of emotional depth. But then again, it's not bad. A lot of the characterization is pretty serviceable for this type of movie, so I'm ultimately going to give it a 6. Round 2, Setting. So, one thing to keep in mind for this round is that there is a distinct visual difference between the first two Doom games and the third game, which this film takes direct inspiration from. While all the games take place in the future, usually on some sort of Mars base, the third game is significantly darker, at least visually, and really does a good job of creating an unsettling atmosphere while still feeling like the same universe as the original games. The graphics were also very impressive for their time, making the game difficult to run on the consoles of the day. It's pretty clear from a casual glance that the film's production design is taking heavy inspiration from Doom 3, and for what it's worth, it looks pretty accurate. You can tell that a lot of effort went into making these sets. I mean, the scale of everything is impressive in its own right, but there is a lot of attention to detail towards making the Mars base feel like a real, lived-in environment. It's not at all difficult to imagine this is the same environment from the game. Now, the film is set almost entirely on the Mars base, which works fine, but one problem I had is that the Mars base and the Earth base look exactly the same, so it's difficult to get a sense of being on Mars. There is one very brief scene where we see the exterior of Mars through a window, and I do wish that they could have featured the exterior of the planet more prominently in the movie, but it was probably a budget issue. One place where they definitely did not skimp on the budget was the creature design. At first I thought the creatures were CGI, but according to the behind-the-scenes videos, they're actually done with really convincing full-body makeup. It's very strong work, but it does beg the question, why do the filmmakers feel the need to constantly keep the creatures in the shadows? I feel like we never really get a good look at these monsters because it's always too dark to see them. Which is funny, because I just said in the Alone in the Dark video that that movie wasn't nearly dark enough, and here we have a movie that seems a bit too dark, to the point where some of the sets seem to have been designed without lights. And while the color palette does match the game, for the most part, it does have the unfortunate side effect of feeling maybe a bit too serious for its own good. But maybe that's more of a story issue than a setting issue. Production designer Stephen Scott, known for his work on the Hellboy movies, did a really good job. The sets are both accurate and big, and you can tell a lot of time and effort was put into making this look that way. With that said, there are still problems to be had. As the film goes on, you do wish you could see more than the same old dark hallways and offices. The game made use of these dark environments too, but then gradually opened the action up to make the set pieces feel bigger and badder as they went on. But I guess that's not the direction that the writers wanted to go in. For what the sets were supposed to accomplish, they do a really solid job. It's not perfect, but I did genuinely feel like I was in the same universe as the games for most of the runtime, and that goes a long way. I'm giving it an 8. Round 3, Story. The original Doom video game from 1993, despite being revolutionary and hugely popular, didn't have much of a story. I'm not saying that as a slight against the game. Programmer John Kranick was quoted as saying, "Story in a game is like story in a porn movie. It's expected to be there, but it's not that important." This is not a quote that I agree with, but ignoring that for now, the first game's narrative was about as basic as you can get. You are on Mars. There are demons on Mars. You have to kill them. Go ahead. Doom 3 was able to tell the same basic story, but expanded upon it just enough to make it a little more interesting, albeit not by much. So you'd think that the screen artist for this film had a very simple task in making sure the film hit the same story beats that are present in the games. Surely you can't screw that up, right? Well, okay, the game takes place in the year 2145 and is set primarily on the Mars base. The film takes place in 2046, not really sure why you felt the need to change that, but whatever. At least we're on the Mars base. We've seen these soldiers that are looking to investigate suspicious activity when monsters show up and they have to fight the creatures off. The story also takes direct inspiration from the instruction manual of the first game, by taking the written backstory of a space marine disagreeing with his sergeant because the sergeant wanted to kill innocent people, and making that the main foundation of the arc. As said before, the film handles the transition of the Sarge character and his gradual descent into villainy really well. So it all seems to match up. This should work. Except for one pretty important detail. See, in the game, when the characters are on Mars, a portal to Hell is opened up. You heard that right, Hell. The demons explicitly come from Hell, and the player has to go to Hell to stop them. In the film, there is no Hell. Apparently, the producers of this movie were very religious, and they demanded that all satanic elements be removed from the story, which kind of begs the question, why would they be drawn to adapting this material in the first place? I mean, the games make it pretty clear that Hell is supposed to be bad, so I'm not entirely sure what their problem was. In fact, knowing this information calls into question the scene where the guy carves into his arms. Was that meant to be viewed in a positive light? Because it was weird and then never brought up again. So, the dialogue does reference hell and demons, but it does so in a strictly metaphorical way. The creatures that the soldiers face have a more scientific explanation for them. I think. It's complicated. See, it's revealed that the creatures were once humans who had been exposed to something called C24, but unlike in most zombie stories, the serum doesn't turn everyone into monsters, just the ones who have a predisposition to violence. Now, I'm not gonna lie, I thought this idea was pretty interesting. A sentient parasite that picks and chooses who to infect based on morality. Honestly, it might have worked better if the story was still set in hell and it directly tied into the morality of that, but as is, it at least provided some interesting ideas, which you don't usually get from a video game movie. Then again, maybe that was the problem. When people buy a ticket for a movie based on this game, they're not expecting to get a deep dive on morality. I think it might have worked better if I bought into the relationship between John and Sam and that was more of an emotional hook. I do think it was an interesting idea to have the two of them be siblings instead of ex-lovers, but the writing doesn't give us a good sense of the history between these two, and the actors' lack of chemistry doesn't help. The story does essentially treat Sam as if she were a love interest character rather than a sibling. But with all that being said, I do think this movie had some good ideas behind it, more so than a lot of other movies I've looked at in this show. The writers had a very generic plot outline to work with, and they could have stuck very close to the bare bones. Instead, they tried to flesh it out and made it more interesting, while arguably sacrificing one of the core elements of the story with something else. The story flows pretty well, and there aren't a ton of plot holes, and honestly, I do appreciate them for trying to do something with this story, even though the end result is far from perfect. As stated before, Sarge's arc makes up for a lot. For a video game movie, it's above average, which is why I'm giving it a generous 7. Round 4, Experience. If you're watching this video going, wow, he's really being generous to this movie, well, this final category is where that starts to fall apart a bit. To put it bluntly, this movie is suffering from a bit of an identity crisis. And what's funny is that it's the exact opposite problem that the first Resident Evil had, where that should have been a great horror movie, but it wanted to be an action movie instead. Well, this is a film that should be an action movie, but wants to be a horror movie. Allow me to explain. The original Doom game was known for its non-stop violence and action, never a dull moment to be had. With Doom 3, they tried something that was a little different. It was slower paced and had a greater emphasis on horror. And honestly, from what I was able to play, it was really effective. There still is a lot of killing and gore, but it's paced out better, and they do a really good job of making you feel completely overwhelmed and outnumbered. The game really knew the best way to combine action and horror. The same cannot be said about the movie. The movie starts out very strong, with a really tense opening scene that showcases the gore, and the reveal of the opening title pumps you full of adrenaline. The film then wastes no time in setting up the characters and getting them to the Mars base. Then they get their guns out, and the cool music is playing. Then they go down this hallway, and then they talk to this person, and then they go down that hallway, and then they start looking for, it's right around this point that you realize nothing's actually happening. The movie is using its editing and music to try and make you feel pumped up and ready for action, and then it takes a long, long time to actually deliver on that action. While the film gives off the aesthetic of a high-speed action movie, the actual pacing of the film is much more reminiscent of a horror movie, except it even fails at that. In the rare moment where there is an immediate threat, the characters are always quick to take it down. As a result, the Marines come out looking significantly stronger than the creatures they're up against at all times, which kind of ruins any sort of tension that they were going for. It's not that difficult to make an action movie that gives the main characters obstacles to fight throughout the runtime. There's a lot of movies I've looked at in this show that have managed to do that. Why you would want to take a different approach with Doom, of all things, is really confusing. And it's not like the individual dialogue scenes are bad, it's just the movie wants you to get excited for action that never arrives. One of the best examples of this is the BFG. No, not that one, this BFG. This is one of the most iconic weapons in all of gaming, and the film makes a very big deal about the scene where Sarge acquires it. But this weapon is only fired twice during the whole movie, and both times it's at a wall. And here's the thing, the fact that the film version of the BFG looks exactly like the game version, and is evidently just as powerful, makes it that much more frustrating that we don't get to see it fired at an enemy. Which leads me to what is probably the number one problem with this movie. It looks like Doom, but it doesn't feel like Doom. And you can argue that that's a bigger crime than a movie that didn't resemble the source material whatsoever. It's right there. Right there. We can see it. We're waiting for it to start feeling like Doom. We can practically imagine what it's supposed to be. When Roger Ebert reviewed the film, he compared watching the movie to watching somebody else play the game and being unable to play it yourself. I think that's an interesting way of phrasing it. I still maintain hope that a video game can become a good movie, and what makes this movie so frustrating is that on paper, this should have been the easiest adaptation to do. All the pieces are there. I don't think that cutting the hell stuff was necessarily the nail in the coffin, and I think a lot of what the story chooses to focus on had potential to work. The only thing the filmmakers had to do was remember to include action scenes in their action movie. I should probably mention that this movie is perhaps best known for the first-person shooter scene that takes place late in the film. It's a 5-minute sequence that is filmed from a first-person perspective and is meant to emulate the game camera. While it's not perfectly executed, and I would have recommended switching the aspect ratio up for the scene, it is legitimately impressive and a fun addition to the movie. It's also one of the few action scenes in the entire movie, so there's that. I have heard a few people suggesting that maybe the whole film should have been shot in first person like this scene, something that the 2015 film Hardcore Henry would eventually do, and while I certainly would have been interested to see that, I understand it would have been very difficult for the filmmakers to pull off, as well as a bit too artsy for something that is supposed to be a big budget blockbuster. At the end of the day, this is hardly the worst film I've looked at in this show. Heck, it's probably one of the better ones. There are a lot of things in this movie that work. But the big problem was the pacing and the lack of action. If you told me going in that a movie based on the Doom games would have little to no action in it, I never would have believed you. And that one fatal flaw undermines a lot of other really solid things about this movie. So, in the category of experience, I'm giving it a 4. So, with everything added up, Doom receives a score of 25 out of 40, 62%, for a final score of D. You know what? This feels right to me. This movie and Street Fighter are the only movies to have received these scores. Even though neither is a great film, I do want to acknowledge that effort was put in. But Doom's score could have been so much better if it just had a little bit more action. Anyway, the next film on our list is Blood Rain, and in breaking from tradition, I've actually already seen this film as of the recording of this video. And I can tell you that, of the 3 Uwe Boll movies I've seen, this is by far the least awful one, for whatever that's worth. See you next time.